Hello, my name is Magnus Petersen. This is my tutorial number 8 on TensorFlow, and this is about transfer learning. This builds on tutorial number 7, where we used the pre-trained Inception model for classifying images. You may remember that the Inception model had some strange class names for images that showed people. And what we can do instead is we can train the Inception model on a new dataset. But for this, we need a very large number of images, and we need a very powerful and expensive computer to train the Inception model. So what we can do is that we can reuse the pre-trained Inception model and merely replace the layer that does the final classification. And this is called transfer learning. And this tutorial builds on the previous tutorial number 7 on the Inception model, so you should be familiar with that first. And you also need to know how to build and train a neural network in TensorFlow, and this was covered in some of the earlier tutorials. The Google developers have provided a so-called Bazel script for doing this transfer learning or retraining of the Inception model, but it doesn't really explain how to program it, and that's what I'm going to do in this tutorial. So let's look at a flowchart of what we're going to do. What we have up here is the Inception model, and then I have crossed out the final layer, so this is the softmax classification layer, and then we're going to take the output of this layer here, which we call the transfer layer. And the output is called transfer values, and we're going to send them down here and save them to a cache file on the hard drive. And this is because it is very expensive to process images in the Inception model. On my computer, which is a quad-core laptop 2 GHz processor, and it does have a GPU, but it's not fast enough for TensorFlow. And this machine can process about 3 images per second in the Inception model. So this is what the transfer values look like if we try and plot them as an image. The transfer values are really just arrays which have 2048 elements, because this is what is output of this layer up here. But if we reshape this array, we can plot it as an image, like so. And what we're going to do then is that we're going to take all these transfer values and use them as an input to another neural network that we're going to build. So in this case, we're going to make a neural network which has a fully connected layer with 1024 features or values in that layer. And then we're going to have a softmax layer with 10 features because we're going to use a sefa 10 dataset from one of the previous tutorials. And it has the classes airplane, automobile, bird, cat, and so on. So we're going to take all the images from the sefa 10 dataset. We're going to input them to the Inception model and process them. We're going to take the transfer values, save them to a cache file on disk so that we don't have to recalculate them every time we want to use them, for example, for different kinds of analysis, or if we want to use them multiple times when we're training the second neural network here. And then we're going to train this network here using those transfer values and the true classes that we have from the sefa 10 dataset. And we'll see how to do this below. So as usual, we need to import a lot of things. And here we have the Inception model. And here we have PrettyTensor, which we're going to use to create our new neural network. And here we download and extract the sefa 10 dataset if you don't have it already. And the class names for that dataset are airplane, automobile, and so on, as we saw above. And then we can load the images and the class numbers for each of the images and the class numbers as one hot encoded arrays. And similarly, we can load all the images and class numbers for the test set. And we see that the training set contains 50,000 images and the test set contains 10,000 images. And the sefa 10 dataset was covered in a lot more detail in one of the previous tutorials. So here we have a helper function for plotting the images, and we can use a function to plot some of the images from the test set, like so. And you may remember that these are quite low resolution. As I recall, they are 32 by 32 pixels, and this one shows a cat. But it's very hard to see actually some of these. And you can see it when you have the label. For example, this one, it says that it's a frog, and we can say, oh yeah, it's a frog, 2 eyes and a mouth and leg here and leg here. But without those, it's actually quite difficult to see. So we shouldn't expect our neural network to be able to fully recognize all the images. We also need to download the pre-trained Inception model, and this is done in this function here. And then we load the Inception model in this function here. And this is covered in a lot more detail in the previous tutorial. So now we get to the point where we're going to calculate all the transfer values. So let's just go back and have a look. So what we're going to do now is we're going to input all the images from the sefa 10 dataset into the Inception model. And we're going to calculate the output of the transfer layer These are called the transfer values, and we're gonna save them into the cache file. So we're gonna calculate these values down here for all the images in the sefa 10 dataset and save them to disk. And then later we are gonna build this neural network over here. So we first import this function that is gonna do all the work for us, and we define the names of the files where we're gonna save the caches. And then there's an important step here, because we have to scale all the images in the training set, because the pixel values in those images are between 0 and 1, but the Inception model demands that they are between 0 and 255. So we need to scale them, and if you don't do this, it won't work. And then we simply call the function that we had imported, and I'm going to show you later how this is actually implemented. And it's going to calculate all the transfer values, save it on the disk, and then return them to us. And then we're going to do the exact same thing for all the images in the test set. And altogether this took something like 5 or 6 hours on my laptop PC. But if you have a fast GPU, then it should be a lot faster. So we can look at the shape of the arrays for the transfer values. And for the training set, we have 50,000 samples, and each of those is an array of 2048 elements. And similarly for the test set, where there are 10,000 images, and for each of those images, there are 2048 transfer values. And here we have a little helper function for plotting the transfer values. So first it plots the image that is input to the Inception model. And in this case, it's the puppy dog. And remember, this is just 32 by 32 pixels. So it is very pixelated or grainy. And these are the transfer values that come out of the Inception model and which we have saved in the cache file on the hard drive. And this is not something that a human can decode. Maybe this dot here means that it has recognized an eye here. And maybe this dot here means that it has recognized a nose here. Maybe, we don't know. There are methods for decoding these values so we can see what it is that the neural network has recognized in the input image. And perhaps we will do that in another tutorial. But right now, we don't know what this means. And we don't even know if the Inception model has been able to recognize anything in the image. So let's try and plot the transfer values for another image as well. And this is the input image. It shows a horse. And again, it's very grainy and pixelated because it's only 32 by 32 pixels. And these are the transfer values. These look slightly different from above. There's a dark red spot here and here and here. And those were not really present in the transfer values for the dog, which we see here. But we don't really know what this means. So let's try and analyze the transfer values so we can see if the Inception model has been able to extract useful information and sort of separate the classes that we're interested in. The problem is that the transfer values are arrays with 2048 elements, so we can't really plot that. We need to reduce that to only 2 elements so that we can make a scatter plot with X and Y axis. There are many different ways of doing so-called dimensionality reduction. One of them is called principal component analysis, and we are gonna import it from the scikit-learn, which is an outstanding collection of machine learning algorithms which has superb documentation. It's really well made. So we're gonna instantiate the PCA object here, and we say here n components equals to 2, which means that whatever data that we're gonna feed into the PCA, we want it reduced to arrays of length 2. And it takes a while to compute the PCA reduction. So we limit the number of samples to only 3000, but you can try and do this for the entire training set and then rerun this Python notebook. So the input data that we are going to feed to this PCA has 3000 samples, and each of them is an array with 2048 values. So these are the transfer values for 3000 images in the training set. And what we're going to do is we're going to call this function here called fit_transform. So it's going to sort of train the PCA, and then it's going to output the values where the dimensionality has been reduced. So we can check that the output has 3000 samples, again, one for each of the input samples, but now for each of those samples, it has 2 values. So the PCA has reduced 2048 values to only 2 values. And there are several good lectures on YouTube on how PCA works, so I recommend that you look at one of those. And here we have a little helper function for plotting the reduced transfer values, and it looks like this. And I couldn't get the legend to show all the class names, but for each of these colors, it is a class in the sefa 10 dataset. So this might be frog, this might be a bird, this might be a truck, and this might be a car. So what we see is that it has been able to separate the classes somewhat. It looks like there's some overlap between these two classes. So maybe it's confused between cars and trucks. But we can't really see if the Inception model has been able to properly separate images in the sefa 10 dataset, or whether the PCA is not really able to reduce 2048 into just 2 features. So let's try using another method of dimensionality reduction, and this is called t-SNE. There are several problems with this, and one of them is that the implementation in scikit-learn is not very good, so it cannot handle a lot of data samples, and that is one of the reasons that we have limited to only 3000 samples. And another thing is that it cannot take very high dimensions in the input, so it cannot take all 2048 transfer values. We first have to use a PCA to reduce 2048 to only 50 elements. The API in scikit-learn is very well designed, so it's basically just the same we are doing as we did with PCA, but we just do it for t-SNE instead. So we call this fit transform from the t-SNE object, and then we get the reduced transfer values out. And it looks like this in a scatter plot. And here we see much better separation. So this indicates that indeed the Inception model was capable of extracting useful information from the images in the sefa 10 dataset. And these transfer values can indeed be used to separate those into different classes with some overlap between them. So what we have to do now is build another neural network in TensorFlow, which takes the transfer values as input and outputs the sefa 10 class. So we are trying to find a neural network that can map from these weird noisy images here to the correct class over here. And we just saw from the t-SNE plot that this ought to be possible because the transfer value seems to hold the information needed to separate the classes. And to build this neural network in TensorFlow, we basically just do what we have done in the previous tutorials. So we first need some placeholder variables for the input. So x is the placeholder variable for the input of the transfer values. And then we have the true class, and this is a true class number as a one-hot encoded array for the images in the sefa 10 dataset. And this is pretty much the same as we normally do if we would input the sefa 10 image directly into a neural network, except that we're going to input the transfer values instead. And then we're going to use PrettyTensor to actually construct the neural network. This is explained in much more detail in one of the previous tutorials, but what we essentially have to do is we have to wrap the placeholder variable for the input. So we get a PrettyTensor object, and then we use this PrettyTensor object to construct the neural network. So we say after the input, we want a fully connected layer with 1024 features. And then we're going to send that to a softmax classifier with the correct number of classes for the sefa 10 dataset, which is 10. So this is just like how we would construct a neural network in one of the previous tutorials using PrettyTensor. And similarly, we also need to define which optimization method we want to use, and we're going to use the ADOM optimizer. And now that we have created our new neural network, we need to run it in a TensorFlow session. So we create the session here. And first we need to initialize all the variables. And then we have a helper function for getting a random training batch, which we're going to use during the optimization of the neural network. This is exactly the same as in the previous tutorials, except that we're using the transfer values instead of the images. And here we have a helper function for performing the optimization. And this is exactly the same as in the previous tutorials. So here we have a bunch of helper functions for showing the results. And these are just taken from the previous tutorials. So I won't describe how they work, because they are exactly the same. And I think this is probably the only change in that we call them transfer values now instead of images. And we take the transfer values from the test set here instead of the images from the test set. Otherwise, it's exactly the same. So let's look at the results. Before we do any optimization at all, the classification accuracy on the test set is 10.9%. So what this means is that if we take the transfer values for all the images in the test set, and we input them to our new neural network, and then we calculate the classification accuracy, it is a random guess because all of the weights in our neural network have been initialized to random values. So the neural network just makes a random guess at what the class might be. And what we want to do now is we want to modify all the weights and bias values in this neural network so that it is better able to map from the transfer values to the correct class names in the dataset. So we perform 10,000 optimization iterations, and it is shown here. And what we can see is that the classification accuracy on the small training batch improves gradually, and already after 100 iterations is it actually quite high. It's more than 82%. And it took less than 5 minutes to perform 10,000 iterations of the optimizer, and this gave a classification accuracy on the test set of 90.3%, which means that out of the 10,000 images in the test set for the sefa 10, it correctly classified 9,035 images. Here we have some examples of the misclassification. So this is where, for example, the true class here is a ship, but our neural network thought that this was a frog. And I guess this is because of the green colors, and this is typically seen in images with frogs. I have to say, as a human, this is also quite hard to see. If I didn't know that this was a ship, I would have a lot of trouble seeing that it was a ship. And for this image here, the true class is a frog. And still, I can't really see that either. I guess that these are the legs and this is the head here. But if I didn't know, this would be very hard to see. And the prediction was that this was a cat. I don't know. That's just weird, but I don't really think that you can expect any neural network to be able to classify an image like this, because there's really not a lot of information in it, and a human also has a lot of trouble seeing what it is. On the other hand, this image shows a horse, and it clearly shows a horse, but our neural network thought that this was a cat. At least it's in the same ballpark, sort of, because it's an animal with eyes and nose and ears, but we might expect that it would be better at this, because a horse has a longer face than a cat. Here we show the confusion matrix, and we can see that there's a lot of confusion between a dog and a cat, and then there's some confusion between a deer and a horse, and ship and airplane is also somewhat confused, and I guess this is because a lot of them have blue backgrounds for the sky and for the ocean. And this sometimes makes it hard to see which one is which. So the conclusion is that in tutorial number 6, it took 15 hours on the same laptop PC to train a neural network for classifying sefa 10 images with an accuracy of about 80% on the test set. In this tutorial, we used the Inception model from the previous tutorial, and we retrained it for the sefa 10 dataset, and we achieved a classification accuracy of about 90% on the test set. And the total training time took about 6 hours, because we first had to calculate all the transfer values, and then we had to train our new neural network on those transfer values. So when we're using transfer learning with the Inception model, we get a significantly better classification accuracy, and it took much less time to train than if we had used a neural network directly on the sefa 10 dataset. So now let's look at the actual implementation, and we go into the inception.py file, and I like to use PyCharm editor. And we just need to make some modifications to the class for the Inception model. So the init function loads the Inception model as a TensorFlow graph, and then we need to get the references for the tensors in that graph. So if we go back and look at the flowchart, we need a reference for the input tensor here for feeding images into the Inception model. And then we need a reference for this softmax classifier here so we can get the output of the model. And now we also need a reference for the transfer layer so that we can get the transfer values out of the Inception model. And this is what we do here. So here we get a reference to the output of the softmax classifier for the Inception model. And here we get a reference for the transfer layer. And then we have a function for calculating the transfer values. So it takes an input image, either as a file name to a JPEG file or as a decoded array of pixels. And then it creates a feed dict with this input image. And then it calculates the transfer values by running the TensorFlow session with a reference to the transfer layer and using this feed dict as the input. And then we have to squeeze the NumPy array so it becomes a one-dimensional array. Then we return it. So this function calculates the transfer values for a single image. And here we have a helper function for doing batch processing of many images. And it takes a function as input along with images, and then it loops over all of these images and calls the function. And then it gathers all the results and returns them. This function either loads the transfer values from the cache file, or if the cache file doesn't exist, then it calculates all of them. And it is implemented like this, so if the file exists, then we load the cache file using NumPy. Otherwise, if the cache file doesn't exist, then we use our helper function from above to batch process all of the images, and then we save the transfer values, and then we return them. So this is all there is to the implementation of using the Inception model in transfer learning. And you can download the source code and the Python notebook by clicking on the link below the video.